Hi everybody, this is Dr. Sanjeev and I have been studying some beautiful topics on social justice, and one of the topics that I came across that really fascinated me is feminism. And I have been studying how feminism can help us in the world of therapy. Okay, so this is what I've been doing the last couple of weeks, researching into this. And today I want to talk to you guys about feminism in therapy. And I've divided it into three segments. Okay. In the start, we're going to talk about the history of feminism. And then we're going to move into how does feminism have its context in therapy. And then finally, we're going to end with two case studies that I have read about applying feminism in therapy. So if you were to look at the history of feminism, how did feminism play out? So it all started with something. So it's played out in four waves, okay? So there's something called the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, and the fourth wave. The first wave of feminism, it started in 1800 with women rebelling and asking for voting rights. The second wave of feminism started in 1960 when this was like post World War II, when a lot of women were filling into workspaces because there were a deficit for workforce of men, because many of them had died in the army, war force, etc. And these women were demanding for equality. They were asking for equality and justice. That's how in 1960 the second wave of feminism started. And this was mostly within the segment of the white women, right? White European or American women. And in the 1990s, the third wave of feminism started when a black woman came out with evidence that a person who was being appointed as the Supreme Court judge in the USA, he had sexually assaulted her or something of that sort. And when that happened, more and more women, but he was being appointed any which ways, despite of her coming out with it. And a lot of women empathized with her pain, and they started asking for inclusion of all kinds of marginalized groups, not only the white women, but also the blacks, the transsexual, the intersex, everybody across all sections of society. And that's how in the 1990, the third wave of feminism took towards something called intersectionality, which means across all sections they were doing this inclusivity and asking for more social justice. And then in the 2012, thanks to social media, lot of posts started coming out where women started voicing out their opinions and their thoughts, asking for being gender fair and also protesting against sexual harassment at workplace, etc. And the popular Me Too movement kind of became a pinnacle of the revolution. Now, how does feminism apply to therapy, counseling, practice, etc.? I would like to explore this in, firstly, I would like us to understand what is the problem, what was the problem statement and how did a solution start to evolve, and what are the main principles of feminism that are applied to therapy, and how do you see it play out in a case study? That is what we will move on to at this segment of this video. Okay. So what is the main problem statement of feminism? The problem statement is power imbalance, right? This power imbalance was playing out in two areas: one, in the society at large, and two, also in the world of therapists. There was a level of power imbalance. Now, in the society at large, it took the form of something called patriarchy. Patriarchy is a male dominant society where it's only the boy who inherits property, and that's how it actually initially started. It started right after the agricultural revolution. The inheritance and the patriarchy kind of started after that, but then it kind of became more androcentric rules, and women were kind of suppressed in two areas, that is culturally and also politically. Culturally, there was something that's happening called gender stereotyping, where gender roles started becoming very fixed. Like the definition of what is masculine, the definition of what is feminine started becoming so rigid that men started having problems accepting their emotions, expressing their emotions, problems with sensitivity, and have forced to live up to a level of machoism. And women started facing the problem of the kind of projections, expectations that were imposed upon them of what a mother should look like, what a daughter-in-law should look like, what a daughter should be like. And these kind of gender roles became very imposing upon them. But the sad part was many of them started internalizing these messages for the sake of survival right from childhood. And that kind of a negative adaptation where they no more start questioning what's going on because they have made it part of survival. That process is called gender socialization. And anthropologists and psychologists found that culture was an essential part of the social fabric that was creating this in women, where marginalized and oppressed groups would internalize self-sabotaging messages such as, oh, if I start working more or asking more for my own education, if my family doesn't allow that sort of an education, that means I am selfish. These kind of internal messages start playing out. Or if I do not have this kind of a body shape, that means I'm not beautiful enough. Or this kind of a body is what is attractive to a man, and therefore if I don't have that kind of a body, if I don't keep myself as presentable and as attractive for the majority, which majority and the stakeholders and the more powerful sections of society at that point of time were men, and that would create a level of pressure on the women. This is what and this the kind of negative adaptation towards that started. The term that they coined for that is gender socialization. And it was seen that many of the women were getting into toxic, unhealthy relationships where they would be, the effect of this kind of a bias, that the men would think that, oh, these are the specific roles that women have to play. And if I'm, helping out the women more, or if I'm reaching out to her emotionally, that means I am not good enough a man. Or the women would think that, oh, if I'm assertive and if I'm, outgoing, I am being judged as somebody who's dominating, domineering, etc. So this kind of a bias started rolling out in the society, and political systems had something called marginalization and underrepresentation of women. So this in the political structure itself, the number of women who were holding positions of authority were less, and that created a higher level of male dominance once again. And women and other ethnic groups or certain racial groups or certain sections of the society became a minority, became marginalized, and therefore they were under an oppressive, submissive, suppressing force. So this was playing out in the society, even in the world of therapists, where females were and are the majority as therapists and as clients. But the men made the rules. The men in the world of therapists, they got to define what is mentally healthy and what is not. So if a woman would have a lot of emotional angst or whatever, she would be labeled as somebody who's hysteric. Okay, so these kind of labeling started becoming common. And if there was a woman who experienced sexual abuse and in the childhood and was presenting to the therapist as with some amount of dissociation, so to speak, where when this was happening, instead of looking at that dissociation as a coping strategy, she was labeled as dissociative person or whatever. So this kind of labeling was happening, and this was the problem. And the women took a stance. The women said, we got to change this. And So how did feminism start out in the world of therapy? One, they started becoming more inclusive. So what was happening here was even the morals, the human development of how human development should take place, that was defined by male therapists, except for Adler. Adler was one of the psychologists who took the stance of a feministic point of view, but except Adler, every other man, they have very rigid definitions of what human development and what mental health ideally should be. And this was correct from their angle. But women had a whole cultural, women's issues were different, right? Women, so that is how feminism in therapy brought about a whole greater level of inclusivity. So it became more diverse in terms of including what all kinds of issues they could address in counseling and therapy. And they asked for a more gender fair approach, right? Not more androcentric or favorable for men alone, but also inclusive and favorable in the context of women. So therefore they kind of created a new framework and in the world of therapy, and mainly identified three areas where feminism in therapy is relevant. And these are the core issues, and these are the three areas where if there is fair play and power is reclaimed, it is very, very therapeutic. So number one, the core area was gender and gender stereotyping that took place. So as I already spoke about how the gender became very compartmentalized and men and women had to fit into that box. That was the problem with gender. And then about social identities. So men and women, they belong to different social groups. So in one is the family. So being a son or being a daughter, being a wife, being a husband, being a daughter-in-law, this becomes one social identity. And then you're in your workplace. So in the workplace you have a different social identity. And then perhaps in your friend circle you have a different social identity. And in religion, your religion is a different social identity. And now the power balance or power imbalance in each of these social identities can define your mental well-being. So for example, a woman is a black lesbian of a particular small group of religious community. It would mean that all these three identities are kind of marginalized. She may be black, she may be lesbian, and she's belonging to a minority of religious group. So this would mean that all three social identities that she's having may be kind of marginalized, so to speak. And this may not play out really well for her sense of empowerment and sense of self. And the which brings us to the third area of feminism in therapy, that is talking about the power balance or the power imbalance. So where is the client giving away their power, and where can they reclaim their power? And now if from a gender stereotyping area, if you go towards more gender sensitive and a gender neutral approach, they reclaim the power. When they identify the social stressors and unfavorable circumstances in each of the social identities, they reclaim more power. And if they understand the power dynamics and balance that power and head towards a higher level of equality, they still balance and reclaim the power. So these are the three areas where feminism in therapy is very, very relevant. And these are also the three stress areas for women. Okay. And what that brings us to the 6 principles of feminism in therapy. So when you are a therapist and you are looking, how do I incorporate feminism in my therapy? These are the six basic principles. Okay, the number one is something called egalitarianism. Egalitarianism means being equal. So this believes that the therapist and the client are at an equal level. Okay, so how does the therapist create a according to conventional psychotherapy or conventional modes of uh, you know dialogue, the therapist was seen as an authority and the client is seen as somebody at a lesser level than the therapist. And the therapist or the doctor, psychiatrist, doctors often told the client what to do. You need to do this, you need to do that, this is the way, and this is what is normal, this is what is abnormal, this should be the therapeutic goal, and you have to take these medicines, and you need to work this way. So this is like almost like talking down to men or women who were already in a other relationships which were having a power imbalance. So bringing in the concept of egalitarianism is all about decentralizing that power and telling the client, hey, you know what, you are going to be in charge of this therapy, and I am only a service provider, and I'm with you in this process, and you are the one who's going to be selecting what would be the goals of this therapy session, and you get to pick the direction or the course of this therapy, and I am going to be present with you. Which brings us to the second principle, that is empathetic presence. Okay, so here, the unlike so in traditional psychotherapy, uh, because of the fear of something called transference and counter transference, that is where the client may project something at the therapist may project a certain role on the client. An involvement does take place here. An empathetic presence is encouraged to encourage something, the creation of something called a therapeutic relationship. A therapeutic relationship between the therapist and the client is considered healthy, so that the client can adopt something called modeling, where the client now has at least one healthy therapeutic relationship with the therapist, which can reflect into other areas of his or her life. Now, empathetic response calls for self-disclosure from the side of the therapist. The therapist has to open up and say, I may have gone through such experiences myself, and your experience is deeply moving me also. And coming from a very authentic space and valuing the experience of the client, no matter what the labeling might be, the labels are discarded in feminism and therapy, and the personal experience of the client is valued. The third principle is, about external stressors. So usually in therapy or in counseling models, what happens is, in the name of reclaiming the power of the client is told that you are responsible for your problems, you created this, what is the value of you creating this, etc., etc. But feminism identifies that many problems are external. You cannot deny the socio-political and the socio-cultural oppressive stressors, stress factors that are there. And there is a shift that take place, that's in the session, where the woman oftentimes thinks, oh, if I take a stance, I am selfish and it is my fault. If somebody else is not talking to me, it's my fault. And if my family is disappointed with me, it's all my fault. So there is, and now if the therapist starts, in the name of empowerment, starts saying things like, perhaps you are responsible for this or something like that, it may result in a very dehumanizing thing called victim blaming. Now, we do not want to blame somebody who is already undergoing a stress. So here we acknowledge that, hey, you know what? Your workplace does seem as if, that there is a level of patriarchal values here in this workplace or in this family. There is patriarchy seemingly here, and we can see where the external factors are affecting you or your mental health. And by acknowledging this, we relieve them of the self blame, right? And empowerment, we encourage the client to get self empowered through something called assertiveness training. So we encourage the client to voice out their opinions and to get assertive and ask for what they would truly desire. While that is happening, we do not want them to blindly rebel the system, blindly rebel their family, blindly rebel the workplace. We want to check in their context we want to ask them what could be the consequences of you standing up for yourself, and how would you like to, because you are the best judge, how would you like to, make certain choices, at what pace you are the best judge. So considering their context is what is called ecology. And because there are external stressors, both the therapist and the client become volunteers for effective social change. And they advocate, maybe through social media, maybe encouraging the clients to speak out uh, for better egalitarian distribution of power, and encouraging. So maybe if there is a client who is facing high pressures at workplace, or is from a marginalized community, or maybe she's a single mother, maybe she's divorced, and so telling her that, hey, you know what, you are a survivor of a very difficult condition for many women, and because you are able to because you are familiar with these experiences, perhaps you expressing this, or empathizing, or sharing with other women who are also going through such experiences, might be very therapeutic for all of you. So we do encourage them to form groups, and share with each other. And also social activism. So if there are like women rights, or there is like a maybe like a protest march, whatever, anything that makes them feel empowered for social change is encouraged. So these are the principles of feminism in therapy. Now let us look at how would it play out in an actual session. How would these inherent values play out in action? And let us look at two case studies also. To your office, the therapist first does something called demystifying the process. The therapist tells the client, hey, you know what? Over the 1 hour session, this is a kind of a conversation that we would be having, and you are going to be in charge of what you want to share, and there's going to be absolute confidentiality and it's creation of a safe space over here. And then we move on to something called self-disclosure, where the therapist shares that these are my personal values, some of the values that I have, and this is who I am, this is the space that I come from. And some of these values you may agree, you may not agree with. So putting it out there would help the therapist to avoid something called value imposition. Now, when we are going to ask client for something like, uh, effective social action, etc., it's variable what the client might value as something that is acceptable to them, versus it may not be acceptable for the therapist. But in this line of therapy, we go with the client. The client is the best judge. So expressing that at the very start might be helpful for the client to choose certain suggestions and also reject certain suggestions, because the therapist himself has told, hey, you know what, I'm in case I do suggest certain things during the session, you have absolute freedom to reject certain suggestions and take those suggestions that work for you. But as much as possible, we refrain from actively suggesting too much. We go with the pace of the client, and then we do something called informed consent. So informed consent is where you tell the client that if these are okay with you, we can proceed with the session, or you have the complete freedom of terminating the session. And it is your right to establish this therapeutic relationship, and you are the one who is choosing the course of your session. And if you are comfortable and if you would like us to proceed, we surely can. So you take the consent of the client for proceeding with the therapy. And then once the client is comfortable, and once the client is willing to open up with the level of safe space that you provide for the client, we invite something called gender role analysis. So we ask the client, so what are some of the social messages that you have received growing up, about your particular gender, man or woman. And once the client starts sharing all of these internalized messages about what being a man is all about, according to the messages they grew up with, or what being a woman is all about, according to the messages they grew up with, then we do something called gender role intervention. We ask them to actively question these expectations that are imposed upon them. Okay, so for example, if the man says that, hey, I am expected to be emotionally withdrawn and stoic and not express my emotions, and if I express my emotions, I'm considered weak and sensitive. And then the feminist therapist asks them, okay, kind of challenging those expectations imposed, like, okay, so is it always, is every man who is expressive of his emotions, is he weak? Have you seen examples of men that may be comfortable in expression of their emotions and are still considered strong or respected by society, etc.? So you kind of help them, invite them to a space where they regain their own sense of freedom and empowerment beyond the gender role. And power analysis, we invite them to look at what are some of the areas where they've lost out their power, and how can they reclaim the power. And some of the empowering questions that we can ask here would look like, hey, what's the most empowering choice that you can make in your situation right now? What choices are available for you that if you make them, it would take you to a more empowered space, something like that. And reframing and relabeling. So if the client is saying stuff like, I'm a loser because this and this, and if I ask for this particular thing, I am extremely selfish, I think, right? When they say stuff like that, you ask them to relabel it. So instead of using the word I'm selfish, you can say, the client is encouraged to say, I'm assertive in asking for what I require. And instead of saying I am weak or I'm a loser, you can start saying things like, I deeply care. I deeply care for the people around me. So you encourage them to relabel it and reframe the whole context of the self-blame from an internal space to also acknowledging the external stress factors. And then comes something called the assertiveness training, where you encourage them to actively ask questions to themselves and actively ask for what they want, stand up for themselves. And these kind of assertiveness is encouraged, acknowledged and encouraged. And there's another, so this is not unique. Bibliotherapy is not unique only to feminism. It's also there in other forms of therapy, but it's been adopted as one of the practices in feminist therapy. So bibliotherapy is about, so you, as you reach the end of the session, you have discussed the goals for the therapy, etc. And now as you're reaching the end of the session, you plan the next session and you ask them, what do you think should be the outcomes for next session, or what do you think should be the action plan until we meet for the next session. And that is, once the client talks about that, that's when you can suggest them reading material during the week. So if you're spaced out the session between one session to the other session, there's like a week or something. This is where we suggest to the client saying that, hey, you know what, during this week, why don't you read this particular book or this particular movie or this particular documentary. I think you can, you might really resonate with this character. So women resonate a lot with books written by other women who are at an empowered space. So this is kind of like a role modeling for men and for women. And reading a book also breaks down the power difference between the therapist and the client. So you discourage dependency. So the client is not dependent on the therapist anymore. The client, when they come in for the next session, they have more stuff to share. They might start sharing that, hey, I read this book and this is what I learned, and these are the questions that I have. So it might empower them more. And finally, uh, call for social action. So encouraging them to uh, maybe blogging, writing, self-expression, and creating self-help groups, etc., and asking for the social change. these are some of the elements of feminism into therapy. Now let's take an example of, because see, many people think that feminism is only for women, but feminism helps men equally. So feminism is about men and women. It is about inclusion. It's not about exclusion. Okay. So I was reading this textbook of psychology, authored by Corey's textbook of psychology theory and practice for counseling psychology. And in that textbook is from where I took up all this material that I shared right now in this particular video. And also in that book, Corey shares two cases, one case study of somebody called Stan and the other case study of another woman called Gwen. Okay. So this guy, he comes to the therapy to this particular counselor, Puri, and he says, "Okay, I'm an alcoholic, and I have a feeling that I'm a failure, and I have low self-esteem every time I approach women. These are the presenting problems he comes to the session with." And so Cody, the counselor, he he tells Stan, "Okay, so we are going to be having a dialogue. You are going to be in charge, and I'm as a man, I have also sometimes experienced these kind of emotions, and I completely get the space you come from. And you would be in charge of this particular session and the way you would like to take it forward. And if you would, you know, like us to have a discussion about all of these things, we can begin." And that's how the session progresses. And the counselor asks Stan, "Okay, so what are some of the messages that you have received from your parents while growing up about what it means to be a man?" And then Stan shares that, "Oh, my father used to say that I am a sissy while growing up, and that my mom sometimes used to say, you're too sensitive to be a man." So these kind of messages I remember from childhood, and while growing up, I feel very insecure about this. And so when he shares this, the counselor is now inviting him to ask questions about these things. So he asks him, "Do you know of men who may be sensitive, but they're not sissies?" And then Stan starts sharing that, "Hey, you know what? I had a professor. This professor, he was very respectful, and he was very kind. And, he was a great guy. And by no means is he a sissy, but he's also very sensitive." And now he starts getting active role models to challenge his belief system. And now the counselor is asking Stan, "Okay, so can you identify some areas where you are giving up your power?" And then he identifies that, "Hey, you know what? I give up my power to alcohol, and I think I'm a failure, and women are superior to me, and therefore I cannot approach women. I'm very nervous about this, and every time a woman has ever rejected me, I've taken it very personally, and I have very low self-esteem." And here, the counselor is encouraging Mr. Stan, okay, to, and he has labeled himself as, I'm a loser. And now he's encouraging him to, shift the labels and reframe the sentence as into something like, "I am a very kind and caring man, and I've had bitter experiences because of this kind of strict and solid expectations of what it is to be a man." And the counselor comes from a very empathetic space, right? And has these discussions with him. And that allows him to really open up. And also, the counselor encourages him to stand up, not to fight against this kind of practice, but to create a safe space for himself and for other men. And he kind of he asks Mr. Stan, "What are your strengths?" And then he shares that, "Hey, my strengths are that, I'm very good with people, and I can bond with people very well. I'm very good at making people comfortable, and I'm, very good with art." And then, so the counselor is encouraging his strengths rather than focusing only on the weaknesses, and asks him to paint more as a form of self expression, and also engage with other men who might be facing similar problems, who might be trying to quit alcohol, just like Stan, who's who's one of Stan has framed one of his therapeutic goals is that I want to quit alcohol. So he encourages Stan to also read a book about real boys. So there is a book called Real Boys. I forgot the author's name, but in that book, he explores the challenges and the problems of men because of the imposed toxic masculinity that society projects at men, that men are supposed to engage, supposed to initiate sex all the time. They're supposed to always be ready for sex, and they're supposed to only take a relationship towards sex with any man or woman. That's a socially imposed role at men, and men struggle to always stand up towards that expectation. So he's encouraged to read a book before the next session, and he's also encouraged to help other friends of his who may be facing similar issues and help them also to open up. So in this way, feminist therapy takes place for a man. Now let's look at another case study. So her name is Gwen. Okay, so Miss Gwen uh, walks into the counseling office, and the same way the therapist is demystifying the process, does self-disclosure, and he also shares, right? Here he shares that, hey, I am a man, and she comes with the problem. She shares that my problem is that I am a black woman, and no one takes me seriously at my workplace. So that's the kind of a thing that I'm facing, and 90% of the people at my level are all men, and I'm one of the very few women in my organization, and I'm facing this kind of a separation, exclusion, and pressure. So when she presents with that problem, the therapist does self-disclosure because he doesn't want the same kind of equation to play out between the two of them. So the therapist shares from a space of vulnerability. The therapist shares, you know what, I'm a man, but I'm going to try my level best to empathize the space from which you are coming from, and there might be some things that I may not have experienced, and and I want to acknowledge where I stand to be privileged, and I also want to acknowledge places where I may not resonate completely with your problems, but I'm going to stay with you, and I'm going to do my best to understand your problem and empathize with you completely. So that self-disclosure takes that kind of a separation between, oh, I'm a woman, how can a man understand my problems? So it takes away that worry, and even from the mind of a therapist and even from the mind of the client. And then he tells the client that you are going to be in charge of the session, and you can choose what to share, what not to share, and we are going to understand your cultural values, and we are going to encourage you to take choices, or move forward at your own pace. And then he understands the problem. The therapist receives from the client what she has to share, and she is sharing that every time I suggest a new idea to my board, they pretend as if they don't hear me. And another guy, he stands up and he shares the same idea, and they all listen to him. And I am feeling that it's because of my race. And when I share this with other women, the other women are telling me that, oh, you're complaining about being a black woman again, something of that sort. And I feel very, very, suppressed and sad about this fact. And when she's sharing like that, the counselor completely empathizes with her and tells her, please don't blame yourself for this. And perhaps there is a level of this kind of oppression that is happening in the organization, and please don't blame yourself. So that kind of puts the client at ease. And then he starts asking her, okay, uh, and the client is saying that even though I am sharing this with the other women, and if they don't listen to me, I get more angry only with the women. I don't get angry with the men. And sometimes I question my own self. Are they right? Are these men right? And am I wrong? So he asks her, okay, so what are the messages that you have received growing up from your mom, dad, teachers, etc.? And she shares that some of these roles have been, some of these messages, that non-verbal messages I have got, are that men are more important and women are less important. So I've grown up seeing this, and it's been very non-verbal. Uh, that my mom would always eat the last, and when men would come into the house, my dad would look at me and ask me to go inside. And because he asked me to go inside, I thought I'm not important enough. So the feeling of low self-esteem she starts acknowledging it. And in the gender role intervention, the counselor is now asking, when, okay, so if you could ask questions around this, if you could reframe this, is it true that women are less important? She says, no, it's not true that women are less important. Women are also important. And then she kind of changes those subconscious messages that she has received while growing up. And there's a power analysis here. So he asks her, okay, so she's calling herself crazy, right? She thinks, I think I'm crazy. So he's encouraging her to reframe that, and instead of saying I'm crazy, he encourages her to say, I'm a survivor of this stress. I'm a survivor of organizational politics, and I'm a hero. And reframing that, she feels more empowered, and she's encouraged to analyze where she's giving out her power. And then he does this thing called assertiveness training, and he asks her, okay, what are the choices that you have to stand up for yourself? What is it that you could perhaps do? And she shares that, hey, you know what? I can openly say, hey, that looks like my idea, and I don't like it when you guys pretend to not hear my idea and somebody else is taking my idea and speaking it up. It is my idea, and give me due credit for it. So she is volunteering to do a take an assertive stance for herself. And he suggests some books or some resources for her before the next session. And he also encourages her and says that, hey, you know what, there are many women who do face organizational politics, etc. And what if you can perhaps stand up for that? And what if you can volunteer for such causes also? And she is very excited to do the same, and she feels really, really empowered. And that is how we saw two case studies of Mr. Stan and Ms. Gwen, of how feminism in therapy is in action. So I hope you really, really enjoyed this video. I hope this added value to you. We examined how some of these principles of feminism, the 6 E's, egalitarianism, empathetic presence, external stressors, empowerment, ecology, effective social action, plays out in the therapy. And we observed about how these are the core areas, gender, power, and social identities being the core areas of feminism. And we understood the social, the political, the cultural problems, and also the problem that was there in the world of therapists, and how feminism changed that. And we explored the history of feminism, the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, and the fourth wave. And that brings us to the end of this video. I hope it was fun for you, and I know that it's been with a lot of perhaps many new terms and terminologies to learn about. But I do hope that this video or this topic adds more value to your sessions if you're a therapist, and just excites you to explore if you are not a therapist and yet you are interested in this topic. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is Dr. Sanjeev.